So we're a couple years into Star Rail's story now, and I feel like we still don't know anything about Stellarons. I mean, we don't even know for sure if Nanook is making Stellarons, spreading them, or if we've just been misled and they have nothing to do with them. Which is an annoying place to be, because not only is the Trailblazer a living Stellaron, or at least that's kind of our assumption, but every single planet and spaceship that we visited so far has had at least one Stellaron on it, and I really don't think that trend is going to stop anytime soon. So with Amphorius just around the corner, I started wondering if we were going to find a Stellaron there too, and if so, would it be shoved aside in favor of other plot points like we saw on the Luofu and Penacony, or would Hoyoverse put the Stellaron front and center and finally give us some relevant lore about them? You know, like they started to do back on Eurilo 6. Now, I personally think there's a good chance they will put the Stellaron front and center, because after doing some digging, I've come to the realization that there is also a very good chance that Amphorius is closely tied with Stellaron shenanigans. And this might sound a little bit odd coming from me, given that I just made a whole video about how I thought Amphorius' real problem, you know, the black tide of madness thing, was actually the anti-organic equation that came from Emperor Rupert's Machine Wars. And that still may be true. However, during my original investigation into the black tide of madness in Amphorius, I actually found two strong candidates for it, and one of them was the anti-organic equation, but the other one was a Stellaron. So since I've already explored the anti-organic equation, I think today we should explore the Stellaron. So here's the plan. We're going to start this video with an overview of how the universe of Star Rail functions on a physical and metaphysical level, because it's kind of important to understanding how everything could possibly fit together, and then we'll go and talk about the Stellaron, what it is, what it does, and all that kind of stuff, and then we'll finish things up with a small theory about how Stellarons are actually affecting worlds using Amphorius as an example. But before we dive into the thick of things, I'd like to take a second to thank the sponsor of today's video, Southern New Hampshire University. When I was in high school, I did not put much thought into my college selection. I kind of thought they were all basically the same, so my choice didn't matter that much. I was very wrong about that, but I wouldn't know I was very wrong about that until after I graduated and went out hunting for my first job with my shiny new degree, because that's when I realized that the skills my college taught me were woefully out of date and no employer wanted them. It was a huge waste of time and money, and had I known then what I know now, I would have picked a different college, something like Southern New Hampshire University, because their degree programs serve as actual job preparation. Their teachers have appropriate levels of real-world experience, and they share that experience with you, and SNHU will also be there to help you as you begin your job hunt after you graduate. SNHU is also extremely affordable, and as we all know, college can get pretty pricey, but as a non-profit college, SNHU has been able to keep tuition costs low. In fact, their online tuition rates are some of the lowest in the country, and they're really flexible too, whether you're in high school thinking about your first career path in life, or a little bit older like me and wanting to make a bit of a change. SNHU is ready to accommodate. They offer both online and on-site degrees, and they have a huge selection of degree programs, something like 200 plus options. You could study psychology, cybersecurity, computer science, finance, sports management, and my personal favorite, video game development. But to me, the best part of SNHU is that if you want more information about your potential degree programs and everything involved with that, you can actually talk to a real person, someone who's been where you are and who's happy to help. Doing so is both fast and free. You can simply go to snhu.edu/ashikai or click the link in the description to learn more about SNHU's degree programs to see if they're a good fit for you. Thanks once again to Southern New Hampshire University for sponsoring this video, and now it's time to get back to our theory. Now, there will be timestamps, citations, attributions, and links to related content in the description box, which you can access at any time, and should there be any post-video notes and corrections, you'll be able to find those in a pinned comment. So alright then, there's no more time to waste. Let's dive into how the universe of Star Rail works on a physical and metaphysical level. Now, there are many in-game theories as to how the universe was created in Star Rail, the most popular of which, and also the most likely, is called the imaginary tree theory. This theory suggests that in the beginning of time, there was only a big primordial sea of chaos that contained all of the material that had yet to be created in one chaotic, formless mass. Then suddenly, that chaotic mass began to order itself, piece by piece, concept by concept, branching outwards in the form of a great cosmic tree that then formed the physical universe as we know it. Now, we can think of this sprouting of the tree from the sea as something akin to the Big Bang. The sea would be like the dense singularity of energy and particles at the beginning of time, while the tree would be the outward expansion and reformation of those raw materials into what we now recognize as our physical universe. While Star Rail's physical universe is referred to as a tree, and more specifically an imaginary tree, which we'll go over a little bit more in detail in a bit, it's important to understand that the physical universe is not a literal tree. The tree terminology here is more metaphorical, and it's likely referencing the structure of a cosmic phenomenon that's something like a supercluster. And a supercluster is basically a massive network of galaxies. So if each galaxy is like the leaf of this superclustered tree, then the branches are these pathways between the galaxies. Hence, it kind of has this metaphorical structure somewhat like a tree, but it's not like a literal tree. And this would perfectly match the way the tree is described in the databank's entry on the imaginary tree theory. Now, the image I'm using to illustrate the supercluster is actually an artist's rendition of the Laniakea supercluster, which is the supercluster our Milky Way galaxy belongs to. I chose this one because I think it's really funny just how similar it is to the way the imaginary tree is symbolically portrayed in Star Rail. Now, the reason we refer to this tree-like structure as imaginary is because the label imaginary reflects the way in which the physical universe was created. The physical universe was imagined into existence. I know that probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense right now, but consider what the tree is made out of. It's made out of the material that's found in the primordial sea. And it just so happens that this sea is actually a sea of thoughts. More specifically, this sea is actually called the memory zone, and it's a mental dimension that is filled with a thought liquid that we call memoria. Now, we can think of memoria as having a chaotic nature because thoughts aren't bound by the conventional laws the same way the physical world is. The rules that govern things like the passage of time and gravity and space simply don't apply to the realm of the mind. They lack structure, and its data tends to just bleed together, hence its fluid-like properties. So when I say the physical universe was imagined into existence, what I'm saying is that the thoughts in the sea became the things of the tree. Now, that said, the physical world isn't the be-all, end-all of existence, because within the memory zone, memoria can take the shape of the memories that it contains when bubbled or concentrated. For example, memoria composed of the watchmaker's childhood memories took the shape of Misha, a recreation of how the watchmaker remembered himself as a child. These forms are referred to as mimetic entities, which is a play on words referencing the mental properties of a meme and the memoria's power to mimic them. But they are effectively thought forms, which are exactly what they sound like, thoughts given form. Now, this concept of thought forms actually comes from theosophy. Many theosophists actually argue that thoughts are the basis of all things, which is why it would then make sense that this sea of thoughts was the source material from which the imaginary tree created the physical universe. The base material of the thought form was imagined into a physical thing. This thought form concept isn't limited to theosophy, though. Some notable physicists and astronomers like James Jeans buy into a very similar concept on a more cosmic and scientific scale. To quote Jeans, "I incline to the idealistic theory that consciousness is fundamental, and that the material universe is derivative from consciousness. In general, the universe seems to me to be nearer to a great thought than to a great machine. It may well be that each individual consciousness ought to be compared to a brain cell in a universal mind." And this is how I like to think of the relationship between the sea and the tree. So to summarize, the world of Star Rail is one where the sea of thoughts gave birth to a tree of the ordered universe through a process of imagination. But these two realms of thoughts and things are separated by sort of like an interdimensional barrier. In the same way that you can touch your physical body, but you cannot touch your own thoughts, yet they are still unquestionably within you somehow, so too are the mental and the physical realms kept separate in Star Rail. This barrier will become quite important later on, so keep it in mind. Now we've got a great understanding of how Star Rail's universe is structured, it's finally time to identify how Stellarons factor into it. At this point, you might be wondering, what exactly is a Stellaron? Well, according to Herta, a Stellaron is a type of life form that tethers itself to a path or an eon and responds to the wishes or desires of any world it lands on. But on a more simplistic level, a Stellaron is just a star. It's literally in the name. I mean, stellar means star. So okay, they're life forms and they're stars. That's interesting, but it doesn't really tell us anything of value. Like, it doesn't really tell us why they exist or what they're supposed to do. So to figure out why being a star and a life form is significant, and what the Stellaron's true purpose is, we should probably take a closer look at where Stellarons come from. And as far as anyone knows, Stellarons appear to be created by Nanook, the Eon of Destruction. And logically speaking, an Eon pantheon of destruction probably wants to destroy things. And the way I see it, Nanook likely wants to destroy the biggest thing possible, which is the imaginary tree itself. And this prompts a new question. How exactly do you destroy the physical universe? I mean, it seems pretty easy to blow up a planet or two, but that doesn't destroy the universe at its core. If you wanted to destroy the universe, you'd have to destroy the very concept of matter itself. And that just so happens to be exactly what I think Nanook is doing. And I think that this process produces Stellarons as a kind of unintentional byproduct. Allow me to explain. In physics, if you want to destroy matter, you're gonna need to force it to come into contact with its exact opposite, which is antimatter. The collision of matter and antimatter results in something called an annihilation reaction, which is exactly what it sounds like, the annihilation of both matter and antimatter, a process which leaves behind only light and energy. Now, in the beginning of time, our proto-universe was undergoing countless annihilation reactions all the time, and the only reason why our physical universe is able to exist at all is because there just so happens to be more matter in the universe than there is antimatter. So it's not possible to annihilate all matter because there's just not enough antimatter to do that. Now, in Star Rail, the physical world is made up of imaginary energy from the imaginary tree, which we can equate into matter since, it makes up the physical world. So if you wanted to destroy this imaginary energy or this matter, you're gonna have to make it come into contact with antimatter. And that's what I think Nanook is actually doing. I think Nanook destroys via annihilation reactions. Therefore, the path of destruction is also the path of annihilation. And assuming this is true, this would actually explain why two of Nanook's follower factions have such relevant names. There's the Annihilation Gang, and there's the Antimatter Legion. So we're either onto something, or this is just a massive coincidence. Okay, so if we assume that Nanook is trying to destroy the imaginary tree, which is basically matter as we know it, then he needs the tree to come in contact with antimatter. We've established this. Now, this will destroy portions of the tree, but because particles of matter outnumber particles of antimatter, there's always going to be some fragments of matter left over. And those fragments are what I think Stellarons are. They're fragments of the imaginary tree that have been split off as a result of Nanook's annihilation reactions. That's why they started appearing so frequently after Nanook ascended. His ascension likely increased the rate and amount of annihilation reactions within the universe, and the reason why there's no known way to destroy a Stellaron is likely because they're balls of concentrated matter which can only be annihilated with antimatter, and there's not enough antimatter to do that. And that's why the only thing you can really do to a Stellaron is seal it. But wait a second, hold on. I thought we also said that Stellarons were stars because, it's in the name. And yeah, it still works if they are stars. In fact, it kind of works better. Do you remember how I said that the whole tree thing was more metaphorical and that the real shape of the physical universe was probably more like a supercluster? Well, a supercluster is made of galaxies, and galaxies contain stars. So the way I see it, if Nanook annihilates matter within a supercluster, then a Stellaron could just be something like a star that's been split from the imaginary tree, or the supercluster. And this is made more likely by the fact that the imaginary tree theory suggests that the tree is made up of star clusters. So a star split from the cluster would just be a fragment of the tree. And this is such an important detail because as fragments of the tree that create our reality, Stellarons aren't actually vectors of destruction. They're vectors of creation. Which also might be why their relationship to Nanook is so debated. Now, you may or may not be convinced at this point, and that's okay, but keep it all in mind because to prove out this hypothesis of mine, we're gonna need to talk about what we actually know Stellarons do for sure and analyze how they behave. And that, of course, means talking about the Fragmentum. So when a Stellaron appears on a world, it radiates energy that causes Stellaron corrosion. This Stellaron corrosion process breaks down the physical world and creates new alternate dimension-like spaces that we call Fragmentums, which is actually a really funny name for something created by fragments of a tree. We've got fragments creating Fragmentums. Now, Fragmentums are kind of like liminal spaces. The space within them resembles the physical world and tends to possess some similar laws of things like time and space and gravity, unlike Memoria-based worlds like Penacony, but the Fragmentums are generally warped, twisted, and jumbled up. And they're also typically full of monsters, many of which mimic the forms, properties, and abilities of people, animals, and objects that exist in the physical world. And also others who are just straight up people who got corroded by the Fragmentum so hard that they turned into a monster. Now, as players, we actually interact with the Fragmentum all the time. The calyxes and caverns of corrosion that we get our relics and materials from are all products of the Fragmentum, and therefore they are also products of the Stellarons. And speaking of relics, if we take a look at the description for relics in general, we can learn something interesting. The description reads, "Phantasmal equipment formed from stardust contaminated by data." Now remember, Stellarons are stars, so stardust should basically be Stellaron dust, which also gets called light dust. And light dust is the stuff that we use to level up our relics. So basically what we have here is Stellaron dust being contaminated by data, and that data is likely memoria, or at least memory data that serves the same purpose as memoria. But I think using terms like contamination or corrosion is a bit misleading when it comes to describing what the Stellaron is actually doing here. Since a Stellaron is, allegedly, a fragment of the imaginary tree, we can assume that the tree and the Stellaron have the same tendencies. Now, the imaginary tree wants to create physical reality, so the Stellaron should also want to create physical reality. It's probably only the scale at which they can do this that differs. A Stellaron is much smaller than the imaginary tree, so it's gonna need more raw materials or thoughts in order to make more things, hence why it tends to contaminate more data in order to form light dust. And it also might explain why the Fragmentum is described as having the unceasing will to expand, because that's what the tree does. Now we know that the imaginary tree and everything in it is predominantly made out of imaginary energy. We can assume then that Stellarons are also predominantly made out of imaginary energy. And if imaginary energy is matter, then light dust, which is Stellaron particulates, should be the most basic or the smallest form of matter, or, well, imaginary energy. This imaginary energy or matter can then be molded into whatever shape it needs to take, as we see described in the description for the self-modeling resin, which is also made from light dust. Now I keep using the word creation here, but a more accurate word to use is transmutation, because the Stellarons are actually breaking down the existing matter within its general vicinity and then mixing it with new memoria in order to create new things. And if we think of this creation process as transmutation, then it makes sense that Stellarons are effectively stars, because stars are the masters of the art of transmutation. Through a process called stellar nucleosynthesis, stars create the elements listed in our periodic table. These elements are astronomically classified as dust, and since they were created by stars, we tend to call them stardust. Everything around us, including our own bodies, are made from these elements, which technically means that everything is made from stardust, just like how every physical thing in Star Rail is made of imaginary energy, or in this case, light dust. Now, you might have also noticed that the descriptive text for light dust says that its behavior resembles that of seeds. If you water them with memoria, then they might sprout and eventually yield fruit, which, as far as the game mechanics are concerned, is going to be a relic. And because this light dust is just Stellaron particulates, I like to think of Stellarons as types of seeds as well, just ones that are capable of creating entire worlds after you water them with memoria instead of just a relic. Categorizing Stellarons as seeds also explains why Herta describes them as life forms. Seeds sprout into life, and the imaginary tree is a complex system that supports life, and Stellarons are the seeds of the imaginary tree, which makes me suspect that if you provided them with enough memoria, it might be possible to grow a whole new imaginary tree from a single Stellaron. Which is noteworthy because the advanced version of the light dust, the Lost Crystal, has its existence described as going against the will of the preservation. And that kind of suggests to me that Qlipoth is something like a guardian of the current imaginary tree. They are unwilling to let this tree be destroyed, and thus they reject the existence of these seeds and what they could potentially sprout. Because, that might mean replacing the tree that already exists. And this is made even better by the fact that Qlipoth is straight up called the dream maker that pulls and influences the will of transmutation, which would directly reference their relationship to this tree of transmutation. Also worth pointing out that Stellaron-related items like the light dust are said to contain information indicating the existence of another civilization. And if Stellarons are fragments of the imaginary tree, which contains countless civilizations, then this statement about Stellaron fragments containing information about other civilizations makes perfect sense. else. But let's not get too distracted here, because the main point I wanted to make in this section is that Nanook is creating annihilation reactions and intentionally or unintentionally fragmenting the imaginary tree in the process. And those fragments turn into Stellaron seeds, which mimic the behavior of their parent tree and attempt to grow into new imaginary trees, creating new worlds, altering existing reality through the process of transmutation. Thus, Nanook's destruction is basically them seeding the universe with Stellarons. Which means that by destroying the tree, Nanook is also kickstarting the process of creation by accident, which kind of makes him a bit more like the Hawaiian volcano goddess Pele, who is described as the, quote, one who destroys and creates in the same breath, since her lava creates new land while it destroys the old land. These two deities even share affiliations with fire, which also might just be a reference to the super hot plasma that's found in stars in Nanook's case. Either way, I find it really funny. But this reseeding of the universe isn't all springtime and roses. As fragments of the imaginary tree, Stellarons are expected to be a bit unstable and thus would create unstable realities. These seeds try to root themselves in order to feed on Memoria so that they can grow and create better worlds. And in doing so, they create fractures in the space between the physical world and the memory zone. And these fractures are what we call the Fragmentum. To put it another way, the Fragmentum is located in the barrier between the physical world of the tree and the thought-based world of the sea. It's a place where the world is in the process of being created and uncreated by the Stellaron at the same time, which is why it possesses the physical properties of the physical world and the mimetic properties of the thought-based realm. Now with that in mind, I'd like you to take a look at this databank entry on the Stellaron Hunter faction. The entry describes the Stellaron as a stone tossed in water that produces corrosive mud. Now if we think of a Stellaron as a seed that's tossed into or is emerging out of water, which is serving as its nourishment, then the Fragmentum is the earth within which it's trying to establish its roots, hence the mud. Now this corrosive mud language is actually kind of important because it's quite possible that this corrosive mud is actually the black tide of madness found in Amphorius. I know that transition feels a little bit jarring, and if Amphorius is out by the time you're watching this and I'm getting the connection between the Fragmentum and Amphorius wrong, it's still okay. A lot of this information is still relevant and interesting, so let's get muddy. Okay, so there's actually a bunch of things that make me think Amphorius has a severe Stellaron problem, which I know seems like a weird thing to say given how Nanook is unlikely to have a presence on this planet, since the three paths involved here are erudition, remembrance, and the, quote, one who hides behind them both, which is undoubtedly the Enigmata, who we're gonna come back to in a minute. But the corrosive mud description of the Fragmentum was honestly the first thing I thought of when I heard of the black tide of madness. And we know that Amphorius will have caverns of corrosion and calyxes on it, both of which are products of the Fragmentum and the Stellaron, so there must be a Stellaron present here. Or 12. We'll come back to that. Plus, the golden blood imagery of the Crisis Heirs are eerily similar to Nanook's bleeding wounds, and these heirs are also called flame chasers because they're pursuing the core flames that power their titans. Now, you remember how Nanook had his flame associations? Well, that might be a Stellaron reference. In fact, these titans might actually be golems that are powered by Stellarons. Because, you know, in Chinese, Stellarons are also called star cores, and they should be somewhat flame-like since they're stars. And titans appear to be powered by their core flames. And since Stellarons are like world creation seeds, it would be very fitting to call them, quote, shards of divinity, and it would also explain the titans' world creating and altering powers. And if I may tinfoil hat for a second, Lality pointed out in her video that the Dawn device on Kefali's back looks weirdly similar to a Fragmentum monster's core, which is dropped by monsters in the Fragmentum. And since it's a Dawn device, and Dawn is brought by the sun, and suns are stars, and stars are Stellarons, then this device could contain Kefali's core flame, their Stellaron. It's just funny to me because if we think of the Fragmentums as places where the Stellaron is imagining the contents of the primordial sea within the memory zone, then the fact that the Fragmentum cores are described as, quote, half primordial, half Stellaron is quite fitting. Also, keep in mind that the ultimate goal of the flame chase is to collect all 12 core flames and offer them up to the Vortex of Genesis, which will kickstart the miracle of Genesis and allow for the creation of a world, which is what the Stellaron should do based on the rest of this theory. So what they're actually doing here is throwing in a bunch of Stellaron seeds into a pool of Memoria so that those seeds can grow into a tree that will make Amphorius into a proper physical world. And that's pretty cool, right? Well, it's also cool that this vortex of Genesis is kind of similar to the phenomenon in the Memoria Rift in Dreamflux Reef. Kaimi calls this a corroded void within the Memoria, while Welt describes it as more of a black hole. So basically, this vortex is consuming or eroding the Memoria that makes up Dreamflux Reef, and the flow needs to be reversed in order for Dreamflux Reef to survive and grow. Now, if we follow this logic, then Amphorius is almost certainly made up of Memoria, much like Penacony. It's just that instead of having this black hole of a rift down here sucking up the Memoria, they may actually have a white hole that's spewing Memoria out instead. And just to lend some credibility to the idea that Amphorius is a world created by and of Memoria, there is this one scene in the trailer where a building shatters, and boy, does it look just like it is made of Memoria, especially when you compare it to similar scenes from Penacony. It also makes sense for this to be a Memoria-based world, since Fuli is, for practical purposes anyway, the ruler of all things Memoria, and their path is one of the three that's fettering Amphorius. However, we have to assume that at one point Amphorius existed in the physical world, and this would have been the time period before the Black Tide arrived. And since there was a time before the Dark Tide, there must have been some sort of disaster that either destroyed Amphorius's physical world, leaving behind only Memoria, or there was a disaster that caused Amphorius to sink or fall through the barrier that separates the physical world from the memory zone. This hypothesized disaster ties into the second path that fetters Amphorius, the path of erudition. See, erudition's Aeon Nous is in constant pursuit of understanding and certainty, but this has a very odd side effect. The more certain Nous becomes of a world's history, for example, the more fixed that world's future becomes, because past events shape the future. So if the past is perfectly understood and therefore set in stone, then the future is set in stone as well. Now, my hypothesis is that Nous calculated an inevitable future of destruction for Amphorius, and this disaster happened, and Amphorius was destroyed. And that's why the path of erudition is present here. But there's a catch, and that catch comes in the form of the third path, which is, like I said earlier, the path of the Enigmata, which is governed by Methus. Now, Methus was presumably born from Fuli's Garden of Recollection out of spite for Nous's certainty. See, Methus also agrees that the past shapes the future, but they detest the idea of a fixed future, and the one who's defining these futures is Nous, through their pursuit of certainty. So Methus goes out of their way to challenge Nous's perfectly calculated future outcomes by obscuring elements of the past. And by doing this, Methus seeds uncertainty, and the more uncertain a past, the more uncertain the future. This means that if Amphorius's destruction was inevitable initially, obscuring its past would create more possible future outcomes. Now, what's really interesting about this is that Methus has some interesting ties to the Fragmentum, and this could be how Amphorius got into the state that it's in. Because you see, Methus likes to be a bit of a playful trickster. They like blending the real and the unreal together, the physical and the thoughts, and they do this by creating rifts in the barrier between the physical world and the memory zone, which allows Memoria to leak out into the physical world. And this is actually how Penacony came into existence, through one of the Memoria leaks that Methus made, allegedly. It's hard to tell because Methus obscures the past, but you know. Now, the influence of the Enigmata on Memoria is also quite profound because it can warp solid factual memories into whimsical dreams. So it's likely that the power to dreamweave actually comes from Methus. Now, whenever Methus creates one of their rifts, they're actually dissolving reality, which is kind of funny because that's kind of what happens in the Fragmentums. Reality is sort of broken down and repackaged by the Stellaron, and this results in a sort of corrosive mud. Now, Methus also appears to create some sort of corrosive mud. In the curio Jellyfish on the Staircase, it says that whenever Methus creates an enigma, which I think is supposed to reference a rift, since the rift blurs the real and the unreal together, and that would certainly result in something enigmatic, Methus leaves behind a staircase into the void, and the remnants of the realities that Methus dissolved drips down the steps. This is the stuff I think is similar to the corrosive mud. mud. In fact, we can kind of see this corrosion process on Mythos themselves. While they mostly boast bright rainbow paint-like colors all over their body, those colors eventually run together and form this black dripping liquid. Now, this dissolved reality that drips down the staircase is also associated with madness. And that's what got me thinking Amphorius's black tide of madness might be the result of either Stellaron corrosion producing corrosive mud, or the process of Mythos dissolving realities and allowing those dissolved realities to drip down into the memory zone. Or it could be a mix of both. Now, with all this in mind, I think it's possible that around the time Amphorius was being destroyed by the inevitability that Nous calculated, Mythos actually dissolved the reality that was around the planet and allowed it to sink through the barrier or the fragmentum and into the memory zone. So the black tide was simply just the dripping remnants of that reality dripping down onto the planet that was now in the memory zone. Now, because this black tide that came from beyond the sky appeared at the same time the world was destroyed, the two events would have become synonymous with each other. And I don't think Mythos stopped there. I think they continued to tamper with Amphorius's memory. They began obscuring Amphorius's past in order to challenge the certainty that Nous had calculated. And this would have created a bit of a paradox and got Amphorius stuck in a sort of loop. Since the true nature of the disaster had been tampered with or altered or even forgotten, it was no longer able to destroy the world in the same way that it was supposed to, hence the paradox. And the only way to break free of this paradox is to collect the core flames, offer them to the vortex of Genesis, and perform the miracle of Genesis. And remember, if core flames are Stellarons and Stellarons are seeds of the imaginary tree, and these seeds of the imaginary tree create physical worlds from thoughts, and Amphorius is a thought-based world, then what they're doing is planting a tree that will literally manifest their world. But until then, the world of Amphorius has been hidden beneath the Fragmentum. Couple more things before we close out this video. You remember how I said that Mythos is kind of acting like a Stellaron whenever they mess around with the barrier between the physical world and the memory zone? Well, the Trailblazer is a Stellaron, or at least plays host to one, and their ultimate goal in this whole journey thing, at least according to the Stellaron hunters, is to eventually face Nanook, the one who's been inadvertently creating these Stellaron seeds. Now, the Trailblazer is obviously related to Akavili in some way, or at least they're supposed to be their proxy insofar as they are traveling across worlds and reconnecting the Silver Rail and thus heading towards the end of the line. And at the end of the railway is a station called Terminus, which also just so happens to be the name of the Eon of Finality who moves backwards through time. The fact that Terminus can even do this kind of suggests that the future of the universe is fixed. It's unchangeable. And it's possible that future actually ends in destruction. It ends with Nanook. Keep this in mind while you look at the Trailblazer's Ascension material, because this stuff is called the Enigmatic Ectostella, aka the enigmatic star from elsewhere. Now, not only is this crystalline star fragment named after both the Enigmata and the Stellaron, but it's also rainbow-colored just like Mythos. A mere coincidence, you might think, but take a closer look at its description. It says it's a crystal severed from the highest of beings, so probably an eon, and it contains ever-changing mirages of the past and the future. Boy, does that sound just like Mythos. In fact, the next line says, civilization is but a thin sheet of ice on top of a deep, dark ocean of chaos, which may refer to the way in which the imaginary tree sits on top of the barrier that separates the physical world from the memory zone. That sheet of glass is the Fragmentum. Now note that the role of the Trailblazer in Amphorius is to essentially decide what Amphorius's past is, to select and record memories in a book and establish a new kind of certainty which should allow for Amphorius to have a new future. That part's pretty obvious. I think most people are on board with that, but have you considered that the Trailblazer is doing the exact same thing for the universe itself? That the Trailblazer may have elements of Mythos in them? That perhaps the universe is currently doomed to be destroyed by Nanook, and hope for the future lies in the seed that the Trailblazer carries. And remember, the Trailblazer obtaining a Stellaron was a plan set into motion by the Stellaron hunters, more specifically by Elio, who, by all accounts, appears to know the future and has been manipulating the events across the universe in order to ensure things play out in a very specific way. If Elio knows how the universe ends and doesn't like what they see, then perhaps their faction is collecting fragments of the imaginary tree with the intention to grow a new one shaped by the journey of the Trailblazer. And I think that's pretty dang cool. Hey, thanks for watching. I had a lot of fun putting this thing together and I cannot wait to see how well it holds up over time. Or doesn't. I'm good either way. Now, I still need to buy a little bit of time while my stupendous supporters dance predictably across the screen. So, I suppose I could share a silly little thought I had. Let's see. Okay, so during the 3.0 special program, the developers said that Amphorius only became visible to the Garden of Recollection because Emanator-level entities appeared on Amphorius, which is kind of neat because this is also how Welt's homeland of Earth was discovered by the Memo Keepers in Honkai Impact. And just like Amphorius, Earth was both deliberately hidden away and stuck in an endless loop of inevitable destruction that they could not escape from. And it kind of makes me wonder if Teyvat is in a similar situation. But what really gets me is the fact that Akavili has never been to either Amphorius or Earth. And I just can't shake the feeling that something or someone has been deliberately hiding these worlds from Akavili specifically. To what end? I don't know. But I think it's definitely worth thinking about and paying attention to. It might become relevant in the future. But I think that just about wraps things up for now. So thank you to Southern New Hampshire University for making this video possible through the power of sponsorship. Another special thanks to my channel members for encouraging my nonsense. And a final thanks to you for watching. Take care of yourselves out there and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.